two different kinds of fronts. So we're going to be looking at what happens where these two different types of air invade each other. So the first one we're going to look at is what happens where the warm air invades the cold air. So if that happens, and let's say we make a cross section of the atmosphere, so we're looking at it from the side, we would expect that the warm air would be coming somewhere from the south in our part of the world. So over here is the warm air, and it's headed towards the north. It's invading, okay? And to the north we have the cold air that's sitting there. So when we talked about convection, what we said was if I have a parcel of warm air, it will rise because it's warmer than the air around it, which is due to density differences. Now here what we're doing is we're forcing warm air to collide with the cold air, but they still have that same density difference. The cold air is more dense, the warm air is less dense. So what happens is if I try to shove warm air into cold air, it's going to want to ride up over the cold air. And so that's what happens, but it kind of forms this very low angle ramp. So when the warm air encounters the cold air, so just to be clear, this is cold air down here in this wedge. The warm air then rises up this ramp. It's a very low angle ramp, maybe just a degree or two, and it goes on for perhaps hundreds of miles. Okay, this is a very large feature. Well, this air, as it goes up the ramp, is rising. And anytime you make air rise, it expands, and expanding air cools, and eventually you'll hit the dew point, and then you get a cloud. So that's what's going to happen to this blob of warm air that's down here. It's going to go up this ramp, and as it goes up the ramp, it's going to cool more and more. So all the way out here at the edge, the top of the ramp, we would have some very high wispy clouds, which we know are cirrus. And then they get a little bit thicker and more of a blanket, and that's what we would call cirrostratus. And then they get thicker still, and that we would call altostratus, right? And then further back on this wedge, we're getting a thicker and thicker chunk of air, and eventually they would be so thick that we would not be able to see the cloud, wouldn't be able to see the sun. That's stratus. And then from behind that point, if it's a well-developed, if this whole thing is pretty well developed, we would have precipitation coming out of this. And at that point, we've got nimbostratus. Okay? Now, this whole thing, not only is the warm air riding up over the cold air, but the actual wedge itself is also moving. So everything in this picture, the way I've drawn it, is moving to our right here. Okay? Well, this spot right here, where the warm air meets the cold air, that is called a warm front. Okay? And it's called a warm front because, let's say you're right here, and you are going to experience this whole thing. When this ramp gets to you and passes over you, the experience is that the temperatures increase, because this air back here is warmer than the air that you're currently sitting in. So in a warm front, the temperatures will increase as it goes by. All right, so let's think about the series of events that would happen here. If you're out here and this warm front is approaching you, now to get from this point to this point might take 24 hours, could be more, could be less. But let's just say that let's just say this whole thing takes let's say, day and a half, okay? So you're standing out here, and this warm front approaches. It's the 1800s, and you don't have any electricity, there's no weather stations, nothing like that. And you're on your horse, and you look up, and you see wispy clouds in the sky, okay? And then maybe 4 to 6 hours later, you see cirrostratus. Remember what that looks like? It's a ring around the sun. Okay, so you went from wispy clouds to ring around the sun, and then if it's still daylight, fuzzy sun, and then later, no sun. Okay, so if you notice that pattern, cirrus to cirrostratus to altostratus to stratus, there's a good chance that it is going to rain in the next, say, 24 hours. So people started to notice this pattern. They started to notice that if you saw this, and you saw this, and you saw this, it leads to rain. So there is some folklore in certain parts of the world that say that if you see a ring around the sun, it's going to rain. This is where it comes from. That is true for a warm front, okay? Now, as we'll talk about in a little bit, warm fronts don't occur everywhere in the world. They occur along that polar front, that zone between the warm air and the cold air, the thing with the Rossby waves. If you live in that area, that's true. Ring around the sun often does mean it's going to rain. But you can get a ring around the sun in a lot of different places in the world and not have a warm front, so that doesn't totally hold true, okay? But that's where it comes from. Okay, so this whole thing, again, in this scenario, is moving past you. Maybe it takes a day and a half or so to get from this point to this point. So your experience would be cirrus, cirrostratus, altostratus, stratus, and then rain maybe as much as 24 hours. Okay? Now, that spot right there is the warm front. That spot. And we can put that spot on a map.